Welcome to the Marquis Masters podcast. I'm Ryan Estes. Most people don't think about security until the moment it fails, and then it's too late. A bad decision made under stress, a situation that escalates fast. One domino hits the next, and suddenly you're dealing with a crisis you never planned for. Today, my guest is Bruce DeShields from Superior Security Consultants, a decorated law enforcement leader with a 40-year career, including time as a homicide investigator, a certified FBI crisis hostage negotiator, and eventually chief of county detectives. Bruce has earned honors like the New Jersey State Chiefs Medal of Valor and multiple Lifetime and Outstanding Service Awards, and he's built a second act helping businesses protect people, property, and reputations. This episode is for executives, operators, and anyone responsible for keeping a team safe. You'll learn why active listening beats force, how stress divides human behavior, and what great investigators notice that everyone else misses, and how to build real-world security plans that actually hold up when the pressure hits. Want more stories like this from leaders who've done the work when it counts? Go explore marquiswhoswho.com and go down the rabbit hole. Then go to marquiswhoswho.com again and find the next person you want to learn from before the world tells you their story. And if this episode brought value, leave a review like you're giving a medal, short, specific, and earned. And now my conversation with Bruce DeShields. All right, Bruce, welcome to the Marquis Masters podcast series. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
100%. And we're going to talk about what you're working on now, your career. And I just want to start by saying thank you because as I'm doing research for these interviews, sometimes I got to dig pretty deep. But your list of honors, awards, and professional associations is so long, I didn't have to do a lot of digging. So you made my job easy. I appreciate that. And as a quick intro, I'm going to hit a couple of beats. So we have New Jersey State Chiefs Medal of Valor, Atlantic City Police Foundation Outstanding Service Award, Muslim American Law Enforcement Association Lifetime Achievement Award, and the list goes on and on. It's incredible. So let's begin here. What first led you to pursue a career in law enforcement?
It's kind of funny, when people ask me, I think it was something I wanted to do since I was a kid, I used to tell people this story about when I was a kid, I was delivering newspapers, and one day while I was riding my bike delivering papers, I saw a couple local police department cars go flying down the road, and I thought that looked pretty cool. So that's what kind of sparked my interest and, got me heading toward that track.
Incredible. Did you ever get a paper up on top of the roof?
Nah, my arm wasn't that good.
I had a paper route as a kid. I did roof a couple of papers. I still feel bad about it a little bit. Amazing. Was there any kind of like that experience you see in the sirens, you seen everything else? Were there any other experiences that kind of drew you to law enforcement?
It's just something I always, kind of gravitated toward, when I was in high school. I joined the local ambulance squad, to, get my feet wet, see if I liked, and then once I went to college, you know, um, I had an opportunity to become an auxiliary special with the Atlantic City Police Department, to see if I'd like that kind of work, which I actually did, and I gravitated toward that way.
Yeah. And it sounds like you did like it because, as kind of I've seen here, you began law enforcement in 1978, retired as chief of county detectives. If you kind of look back through that kid's eyes that was watching that police chase, maybe what was different about your experience that you didn't expect?
The biggest thing I didn't expect was the journey. When you go into this field, I had no idea where it was going to take me, and, when I found out a lot about life, when opportunities arrive, you got to embrace them and take them for where they go. I had no idea, when I first wanted to do this, that I'd end up, doing this career for over 40 years, when most people did it for 25 and, that I'd make the rank of chief. It was something I never expected, and I always tell people that, if you expect something and you don't get it, then you're disappointed. If you
Yeah.
don't expect it and you just work hard, then who knows where it's going to take you.
Yeah. What did you learn about people in, a 40-year career, particularly in law enforcement? You're working with heroes, you're working with, criminals. What did you learn about people?
Here's the biggest thing I learned about people is stress causes people to do a lot of things. And a lot of times I came across individuals who got themselves in situations where, they didn't think it all the way through. They got themselves in a position, that they weren't expecting, and I found that over the years that a lot of times with people, if you just sat down with them, slowed things down, and had a conversation with them, give their chance to, for their brain to kick back in, that you'd have positive solutions.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, you've investigated some of the most serious crimes out there, from homicides, officer-involved shootings, narcotics, violent incidents. What has it shown you about human behavior? Is there a thread that goes through as you mentioned, it's sometimes it's just not thinking all the way through. Is a lot of it have to do with kind of just being young and dumb,
Well,
for lack of a better word?
it's a combination of things. It's being young and dumb. It's being emotionally involved in a situation. Some of the most violent things he came across was when somebody realized that somebody they loved didn't love them anymore, and they were, going off of emotion. Financial stress causes people to do a lot of things. If you got bills
Yeah.
and you have enough money, it'll cause you to do things that you normally didn't do.
Yeah, and young and dumb sounds mean because that's more of a description of me, but kind of I like the expression that hurt people. Have you found maybe you can remember cases where people were able to turn their lives around after maybe, making some mistakes early on?
No, yeah, no, there were a lot of those I came across. You know what? The biggest thing with people at times is that when they feel like they're caught in a corner, they'll act out in order to survive. You know,
Mhm.
so sometimes what you got to do is you got to slow them down and have a conversation with them, explain things to them. And sometimes people just need an option, an opportunity, or another way out that they can't see.
Yeah, 100%. And you're from Atlantic City, is that correct?
No, I grew up in a small South Jersey town called Williamstown, but I went to Stockton University, Stockton College back then. That was in Atlantic County, which was just 11 miles from Atlantic City. So that's how I got involved with that.
Tell me a little bit about your hometown where you grew up, Williamstown?
Yeah, Williamstown. It's a town that's right next to Glassboro, where Glassboro State used to be. That's how a lot of people used to know us. Hey, you had to go to Williamstown to get to Glassboro. So my father moved us here, I think, when I was 4. I went to high school here. Yeah, I went to school here. I went to high school here. And then I went off to college. But, Williamstown was one of those towns that once I got married and decided to have a family, I came back to Williamstown.
Yeah. What do you think is about Williamstown? Or better question, do you think that Williamstown imbibed you with a certain superpower that you were able to take with you through your career?
No, I just say that, it gave me a good foundation.
Yeah, yeah. What was it that brought you back to it once you had a family?
You know what? It was one of those, honestly, hey, it was good enough for me. You know? Yeah, I like the schools, I like the town, so it was like, yeah, I want my kids to go there.
Every generation has its innovators, the people who don't just succeed, but shape what comes next. At Marquis Who's Who, we believe those stories matter. Since 1898, we've chronicled the achievements of extraordinary professionals, people whose work changes industries, communities, and lives. When you're listed in Marquis Who's Who, you're not just being recognized, it's your opportunity to share your journey, highlight your contributions, preserve your personal brand, and create your professional legacy. If you've built something that deserves to last, now is the time to make it known. Visit marquiswho'swho.com to learn how your story can be featured in the world's most trusted biographical archive.
All right. If I'm heading to Williamstown, where should I go for dinner?
Well, you know what? The Library 4 is,
Library 4.
yeah, it's a great steakhouse. You get an amazing steak there. The food's excellent. Service is great. Can't
Nice.
go wrong.
Fantastic. I want to talk about negotiation. You're an FBI certified FBI crisis hostage negotiator. What was the certification process like? What did you learn?
Well, you know what? The biggest thing, and I got to say, in my career, I had two great things. Homicide investigations, that I did for 18 years, and then with the negotiations, I was a negotiator for over 26 years. The initial course when I first got involved, you did a 40-hour certification course with the FBI. And
Yeah.
then, you continue with your training, but the biggest thing that they taught you, and the biggest thing I learned out of that was active listening, and
Mm,
that's, and it's helped me throughout my career because when you have a conversation with somebody, I always say there's two ways to speak with somebody. There's talking to somebody and talking at somebody. And a lot of times people get caught up talking at somebody. And what I mean by that is that I've got something to say. Like, if you and I were having a conversation, I had something to say, I would overtalk you to get you to hear what I'm saying. And what happens out of that is that would make you feel at times that, hey, you know what? You're not listening to my side of the conversation. So active listening, and what we learned from that was, you got to look at the situation, but also listen to what the person's saying, you know? So,
yeah.
it was something that always served well by me. And, as far as negotiations went, I got better. I became a team leader. I put the county team together. We had a good system. We had a good setup. You came across years a lot of people that found themselves in situations that they didn't overly think it through. They got emotional, and it's like dominoes. One falls and then one falls and one falls and one falls. It keeps continuing until somebody's able to step in and stop the next domino from falling. And give those individuals a chance to start to think again with their brain instead of running on emotion.
Yeah. Active listening. I know I could do better at that. I mean, that's kind of the key is like be engaged with what somebody else is saying. That seems like a great negotiation tactic. Is there something that people get wrong or the expectation they have about negotiation that maybe you've learned is actually absolutely wrong?
Well, you know what? Everything with a situation all boils down to the individual that you're talking to and what they've gone through. Because sometimes in a situation or a crisis situation, when we're talking with somebody, they can start talking about a lot of different things that have gone wrong with their life. But the question that I try to find out is, well, why are we here today? What happened today that you and I are talking? Because
Yeah.
it's like if you look at a lot of stuff going on nowadays in the news, you see about all these active shooters and this and that and that and this, that, you have these people that, feel like nobody's listening to them. And they get mad. And now they're going to be, well, you know what? The world's going to listen to me today. I'm going to get my 5 cents. And the number of times that, like, if you listen to news stories and stuff, and they're like, they're speaking to friends or associates of a person that was involved in a situation, you hear the person say 9 times out of 10 or 8 times out of 10, man, he was so quiet that, if he was in a room with us, nobody would notice him. And if you look at social media nowadays, it's all about people, staging pictures and stuff to make their life look so good. And you got somebody that's sitting there looking at that stuff and they're going, hey, they're doing this, doing that, and I'm not doing that. Well, today the world's going to listen to me. And
Yeah.
when we get involved with an individual like that, you got to take that time and tear those layers off to, really find out what's going on.
To give them the attention they seek, maybe.
Well, you know what? Sometimes it's a question of listening to what they have to say.
Yeah.
Because they always feel like, they get frustrated because they feel like nobody's listening to them. So I always used to tell my negotiators, hey, look, the first guy on the phone that talking with that individual is going to have the worst because that's when the guy or person that you're talking with is going to blow off steam. He's going to rant and rave and yell and make threats and all that other stuff because he wants a response. And what I tell my negotiators is, hey, listen, when that happens, you just got to stay calm. Just got to listen to him. Listen to him. If he makes a deadline, don't harp on that. Just listen to him because, in the initial stages, he's mad. And the question is, hey, we got to strip through those layers and find out what he's actually mad about. Negotiations like an onion. There's many layers to it.
Yeah. 100%. And just such a distinguished career, decades rising through all of the ranks, all the way up to chief. What were some of your favorite aspects of the job?
You know, I got to say that the best time that I had, if I had to break it down, was when I was a sergeant and I had a homicide squad. To me, there was nothing more challenging than you get out to a situation, someone that has expired, and we now have to figure out what happened. You know, to me, that was the best part. It was the hunt, the going after the work. Because it's a lot of legwork. And I just love that drive. It just made me just want to work harder. Because in our line of work, we don't get to pick and choose which one we're going to do. We don't
Yeah.
get out there and go, oh man, that one looks difficult. I don't want to do that. No, you gotta work it. And you gotta work hard. And a lot of them, took hours and hours of going through evidence or going through the scene or doing background information. Anything that would help you push forward to solve that case.
Yeah. For a young officer who's coming into the unit, do you have any words of advice or perhaps attributes that you had as an officer that helped you, get promoted so many times and rise the ranks?
Well, the biggest thing I used to, say to them is, listen, my biggest thing was become a craftsman of what you're going to do. If your job, you're a detective or you're an investigator, you got interviews to do, learn how to interview, become a craftsman. I used to say that one of the biggest disservices, like when we used to sit down and interview somebody and say, well, hey, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And they say, hey, I want to do this, I want to do that. Well, here's the problem with that is, not everybody can do everything, you know. There's only, so many chiefs, so many captains, so many lieutenants, so many sergeants, but that doesn't mean that you're not good enough. It just means that, that opportunity hasn't hit at that time yet for you. So, I say to themselves, hey, if you think you're going to do something in 5 years, get it. That's how people get frustrated, because they don't think that they didn't stick by their plan. But my thing has always been, I'm going to be the best of what I can be at what I'm doing. And from doing that, look, I was fortunate, but I didn't move up fast. It took a lot of years, but
Mhm.
I was steadfast and focused on doing my job. I loved doing my job, and just one of the side benefits was I happened to make rank, but it never took away from the passion I had of doing that work.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like that's something missing now is there's more of a instant gratification in our culture, and that perhaps you get passed over on that promotion the first time. Yeah, I've seen experience, where it comes across as catastrophic. People are near tears and they're like, my career isn't advancing, but it sounds like having much longer gaze, maybe like not necessarily um, using the destination as the goal, but really using the path as the way, and through that time, then eventually finding the goal that will suit you.
Yeah, look, the biggest thing with me was always a love for the job. If it's about rewards and the other stuff, it's fleeting. Because everything ends. I did 41 years, and on my last day, I walked out of my office, put the stuff by the side, and went out the door. There's no fanfare, there's no this, no that. It's just the internal feeling of what you have that says, "Hey, did I do the best of what I can do?" That was one of the big things that always drove me. Of course, in the morning, you wouldn't know it now because I got the beard, but I was always clean shaven. Put on a suit every day. During the winter, I had the hat and the top coat and the gloves. I just loved that whole thing. And I'd look in the mirror in the morning and go, "Hey, did I do the best that I could do yesterday?" You know what I'm saying? Because you can lie to other people, but you can't lie to yourself.
The best part of retirement, letting the beard come in a little bit.
Yeah, well, you know what? When things change a little bit, you gotta change things up. I'm not what I was, so I figured, hey, you know what? I'm different now. I might as well make it look a little different.
It's great. It's great. I want to go back to the craft you were talking about. There's a craft involved, and when I'm thinking about your time as a homicide detective, there's a lot that's going to go into cracking a case. There's the science, there's the intuition, there's the experience. How do you balance those aspects, and maybe what are the most important attributes that you bring to craft as a homicide detective?
The biggest thing with me, you can research all the information that you want, but it's the actual interviewing is what's going to make it. I've always, as guys would say, I would talk to you till the cows came home. And I also realized that, look, there are a lot of people that have been in trouble before that they all have in their mind from watching TV and all those other things of how a police interview is going to go. So I would do just the opposite. I would come in and I'd have a conversation with them. I'd talk to them about different things, and then slowly work my way towards certain things, aspects of the case I'm looking at. And what I'd look at is their body language. When somebody's talking, they're nice and relaxed, they're moving around, they're using their hands, but as they start coming under stress, you start seeing them tighten up. You know what I mean? You start seeing them rub their mouth, or you starting to see them mumble, or you start trying to see them, do little things to distract themselves. So one of the things, a quick, funny little story to you. I used to teach at the academy. And one of the things I would do is I'd talk to them about interview and interrogation. And I would tell people the story. I say, hey, one time when I was working in sex crimes, I'm interviewing this guy that was accused of doing something uh, with this young girl. And as we sit and talk, and I talk to him about certain things, I see he get relaxed. But then as I start asking him certain questions, I can start seeing that he's tightening up. So I figured, okay, so I got to have a way to distract this guy a little bit. So what I did was I had a piece of gum and I took that foil that the gum is wrapped in and I rolled it into a little ball and I was rolling it between my fingers. So as I'm talking with him, I'm rolling this ball of foil between my fingers. And then what I do is I sit it down on the table. So when I'm talking with him and he's relaxed, he's calm, he's talking with me. But as I start asking him questions about the case, and I started seeing him get nervous, he would reach over and pick up that foil ball what I had in my hand, and he would start rolling it in his fingers. That's a way to relax him. So then I back off a little bit. I start talking about other things. I noticed he'd sit that foil ball down. And then as soon as I start asking questions again that were pushed more toward the case, he'd reach down and he'd pick that foil ball up, and I see he start rolling in his finger. All right, so I did it a few times, and I realized, hey, that's that soothing mechanism that he's trying to do, to divert me. So I go back and I start asking him some regular questions. He sits the foil ball down. So once again, I start, and he goes to reach for it, and I say to him, hey, do you realize that every time you lie to me, you pick that foil ball up and you grind your left foot into the carpet? And the guy looks. All right. Well, here's the thing was he would pick up the ball, but he never moved his left foot. But now that I said that to him, because when I start putting pressure on him again, he'd look at the foil ball, he wouldn't pick up, and then the first thing he'd look down at his foot.
Oh, tells.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
and once we got past that, then, you know, he, he just started to come out, because people are just like kids. When you look at kids, they got little soothing things that they do. Some of them,
Yeah.
they'll suck their thumb, they'll rub their hand, they'll rub their face, they'll do all kinds of things. Well, grown-ups, adults will do the same thing when stress kicks in. If you look at females, and sometimes, women, you'll start noticing that they'll start picking stuff off their shirt like imaginary lint or something, or they'll look for their pocketbook or something to try to go through something just to try to alleviate, the stress of, because I used to tell my guys, I said, look, here's the thing. The truth will always be the truth. But when somebody's lying to you, they got to remember that lie. So, my thing is I would always, in an interview, I'd just start talking with somebody. And I always tell my guys, do it like a children's story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I have them tell like a children's story. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and an end. But now, once you get that, now we start going back to the individual pieces. It's almost like doing the alphabet. Everybody can do the alphabet from A to Z, right?
Yeah.
Now, sometimes, you go and you have them start at M. Yeah, but it'll always be the same, no matter where it goes. With a lie, they got to remember what they said, and then what happens is, the more it's a lie, the more that the flow of their story starts to break up. So I would just explain to them, especially if you had somebody, because some people are very good at lying. You can ask them a question, and they can give you this whole straight story. But here's the best part is when I go, okay, so you did this, you did this, you did. So let's start here. So now they got to remember what they said in the beginning. You know what I mean? But if it was
Yeah.
true, it would always flow.
I'm making a mental note here. Do not play poker with Bruce. You got to be a good poker player.
Right.
So, we talked a little bit about retirement, but actually, you really kind of moved into the private sector. I'd love to learn a bit about your security company, SSC, Superior Security Consultants.
Yes. So what happened was my co-partners and I, we all had long law enforcement backgrounds. My two partners, Henry White, who did 35 years with Atlantic City Police Department. He retired as a chief. My other partner was Detective Michael Graham, who did 25 years with Atlantic City Police Department. We worked together in homicide a number of years. He was on the fugitive task force. We had very long and diverse careers. And, we were sitting there and we were talking. We were like, you know what? It'd be nice if we took all the experience that we had and formulated a company. We do security work, do security assessments, do speaking, because we all had, diverse and complete backgrounds, and it was like, here's an opportunity to take our experience, and help people out, So we provide armed, unarmed security. We'll go into businesses and, do security assessments, especially nowadays, because, when the economy goes bad and things get tough, people start, getting sleight of hand, you know? So it's like, hey, look, wherever we can offer, to assist, is what we'll do. Also, with our backgrounds, we were all criminal investigators that, we have the ability, if needed, that we can sit down and look at an investigation, tear it apart and tell you what's right with it, what's wrong with it, where you can make it stronger, or, or where we see some inconsistency.
For SSC, who would be an ideal customer? You mentioned kind of retailers, doing consulting for larger organizations. Who's an ideal customer for SSC?
Well, actually, it's a combination of things. Right now, we have a few retail contracts. We try to provide, good service to retailers. There's some construction contracts that we're looking at, going to make a bid for, as we try to expand. But the big thing with us is that we have, a very wide background, and we have access, to a lot of good individuals that are retired law enforcement people or security experts that are, that are looking for work to come aboard, So we try to put out a good product where, companies that hire us, know that their employees are safe and sound and that we offer good service.
What does the future of law enforcement and security look like over the next 5 to 10 years? Obviously, now we have a lot of new technologies, and we're learning more and more that we have to have a human in the loop. What does the future look like for law enforcement?
You know, one of the problems with law enforcement, there used to be a great line. Remember the show The Wire? Did you ever watch
Yeah.
that? Okay. I think it was the second season when Burrell, who was the deputy ops, he was having a conversation with one of his other majors, and he says, nobody tells teachers how to teach, nobody tells garbage men how to collect garbage, but everybody wants to tell you how to police. And the unfortunate thing is that you know when the world gets more stressed out, law enforcement is the only business that's open 24/7. So they get the brunt of everything, And with technology now, look, everybody has a new way to try to do something. But as soon as they do that, that gets outdated. But the one skill that you can never outdo is the ability of human contact. Because, no matter how much digital information you have, you still got to put butts in the seats, If you come into court with a case, you can show all this data, but without a detective sitting there testifying to that, that stuff means nothing. Things have to be explained. The tough part for people nowadays is that for young officers are society's kind of gotten spoiled. I kind of tell people, I said, our problem is people see people like apps on their phone. Nowadays, you have these phones that are computers, and you can download any app that you want that you think is going to automatically work with the other apps that you got on there. But humans aren't that way. They got to have the opportunity to learn. They're going to have the opportunity, to make mistakes because we have this fundamental thing in our mind that everything in the world is perfect, and it's not. You know, so to the young people that are getting in the field now, I tell them, look, there's no greater perfection than this. I said, you got to remember that when people can't handle a day's life, they're going to reach out to you. They're going to call the police because they can't handle what they have going on. And they're going to want you at that time that you're speaking with them to make them think that they are the center of the world. But I tell people, you can't fix everybody's problem, but you can make them think that we care enough to get them through to the next day, and then you give them options.
Love that. And, I think the majority of Americans are so grateful for law enforcement, especially when they really need them. What's the best way that civilians can support the police departments?
You know what? Honestly, the best way is to remember that law enforcement officers are people too.
Yep.
People tend to look, they see the uniform or they see the position, and they don't think you're real. You know, when people talk about the police and they say, well, they do this, they do that, they forget that there's human individuals, that are in those uniforms and are making those decisions every day. They're not computers, so not everybody's going to say everything of what you want or what you expect. Our job is to get you through to the next day or where you have other options that you can take once the sun comes up.
Love that. Now, you mentioned The Wire, which takes place in Baltimore.
Yes.
Now, The Sopranos took place in Jersey. How accurate was The Sopranos?
Well, listen, look, I always laugh and joke about that because, when I'd go to other states, everybody talks about The Sopranos. Um, look, everything is what it is, but did they make it a little more glossier for TV? Yes. But we have those issues. Yeah, look, it's always been around, but look, it makes it for great entertainment.
Yeah, 100%. Now, I know that you do work with mentoring kids and children. Talk a little bit about that.
You know what? One of the things that I really used to, one of the things that I did and put together before I retired was we had a vocational school in Atlantic County. It was called Atlantic County Tech. And we set up this program where I would go have lunch, with some of the students. We sit around a table and we talk, because I wanted them to see that, you know, I wasn't born a chief of detectives. I was a kid just like them, years ago. And, look, I was fortunate by the opportunities of what I had, but the thing was, I had opportunities because I was in the right place at the right time, or somebody, introduced me to somebody, and this is what I found that works is, hey, look, if you have a passion to do this, then I'm going to explain to you how I did, how to talk to them to be mentally and physically prepared, because, a lot of the young people nowadays, because the computers they don't know how to talk to somebody face on. Everybody's texting, they're chatting, they're doing this, they're doing that, but they don't know how to have one-on-one conversations. They don't know how to prepare for an interview. You know, I meet guys that are in college, they're about to graduate, and I have a conversation with them. They have plans, but they didn't know how to do the interview. They didn't know the proper way to dress for an interview. Explain to them, listen, if you're going to go to interviews, buy one of three suits. Buy a blue suit, a black suit, a gray suit, or a brown suit. I'm sorry, or four. But, don't come into an interview with a club suit. You know what I mean? You know, get a pair of black or brown shoes, polish them, iron your clothes. I explained to them that, listen, when you sit down, you talk with somebody, the person that asks you the question, before you start to answer, look at him. If there's a panel there, as you're talking, look at every individual that's in the panel, and then when you finish your question, go back to facing the person that asked you that question. That's showing that you're attentive and that you're thinking things through. And I'd also tell them, if you're going for a job, research that agency. People coming nowadays. I meet these young guys that because they got all that AI stuff on their computers that are writing great resumes for them. And then you sit down. I'm going through this. You ask them a couple of questions. Excuse me, and they had problems answering it. I'm like, don't be lazy. Don't put anything on your resume that you can't explain. You know. So but out of that and talk with individuals is what I really enjoy. Especially I want them to see that. Listen, I did this for 41 years. I was driven on this. And the road that I took, it wasn't easy, but it made me very impassioned about doing this work, and it wasn't until, one day that the new prosecutor and the new first assistant came in, they're like, hey, so what are your plans? And that's when I realized, like, man, I've been doing this for 41 years. You know, it's, it's time to move on and do something else, and like I say, Henry, Mike, and I were talking, and we're like, hey, we're finishing up our career. We're still passionate. You know what? Let's form a company. And that's what we did. We got together with a business attorney. We formed an LLC. And then, the biggest, funniest thing from going from government work to private work is, man, there's a lot of deadlines with the state that, man, you got to cut a lot of checks. You know what I mean? So now I
Yeah,
an accountant, I got to have this guy, I got to have that guy, to make sure that you're doing this by this, that by that. It's like, as I tell guys, I said, it's kind of like when you move up in rank, you're doing more and more different stuff than the core job of what you really love to do. You know what I'm saying? But
100%.
but it's made it good. It's made it fun. It's good. Going out and speaking with people and competing for business and trying to provide a good service. So that part's good.
Incredible, and congratulations. Now, before we wrap up a little bit, I want to take us into the lightning round. Are you prepared for the lightning round?
Fire away.
All right. If you could meet one person, living or dead, who would it be and why?
I'll tell you what. I looked at that question. And I'll tell you what, the biggest thing, my father who passed, I want to sit down with him and have dinner with him again.
Mm,
So he can see that, hey, look, all the hard work and the fruits of your labor is paid off. You know what I'm saying? Unfortunately, he had passed in 18, just before I made chief. So,
mm,
I would like for him to sit down and say to him, because before he went, I said, hey, I may have an opportunity to get this, but to sit down with him, especially because, all the lessons that he taught me in life, you know, um, really meant something. One of the biggest things that my father said to me when I was a kid, and I never forgot this, and I say this to people all the time. My father said to me, he said, something, son, in life, people are going to give you a lot of situations. He says, but here's the thing, if somebody asks you to do something and you got to think twice about it, he says, it may not be worth doing. So he said, if somebody says, hey man, let's go break into the house. You go, I don't know about that. He said, maybe you shouldn't do it. But then he also said, hey, if somebody says something to you on the first time, you go, hey, that sounds great, and it's messed up, then you got to live with those consequences, But the biggest thing he taught me was, life is all about the decisions that you make, So sometimes, before you jump in and say something, think a little bit about it, Look, number of times, you get a case where you got 4 or 5 friends that are riding in a car and they get stopped by the police and somebody had a weapon or somebody had drugs and everybody's quiet in the car and then everybody gets arrested, you know, because nobody wants to look like that bad guy. But yet, once they get an attorney, now everybody's going to start trying to say themselves, and I say the guy sitting in that room, I go, hey, let me ask you a question. If we had the ability to go back 3 hours in time, would you get out of that car? And they'd go, no. And I go, why? He goes, And that's me seeing them, they're starting to think, you know what I'm saying? And then that's when, you start wedging a little fork in there, and now, the truth and other stuff come out, But as I used to tell guys, if you don't put yourself in that situation, you won't be in that situation.
Yeah. Incredible. If you could begin your career again, would you make any other choices or any different choices?
You know what? I would say no, because, you know, if I'd have planned out my career, it wouldn't have gone the way that it went, you know?
Mhm.
Um, Everything that happened, every opportunity, that old saying that when one door closes, another door opens. You know what I'm saying? And that's how my career was. The only thing I would have done different was I'd have been a little more prepared, mentally, physically. My youngest son chose to get in this profession, and once he told me this is what he wanted to do, I was like, okay, we're gonna get ready for this mentally and physically. Here's a performance test. If you got to do 50 push-ups, you're gonna do 60 push-ups. If you got to run a mile and a half in this much time, we're gonna cut it down to this much time, because the whole thing is I don't want them to just see that you can make that number. I want them to see that you can go past that number and then snap back up and get back into attention because you're ready to go. Um, Me, I got to say that, every opportunity that I had, I appreciated the opportunity, and I always wanted to make the best of it. When I was given an opportunity, I wanted them to go, hey, DeShields really appreciates what he does, and he puts his heart and soul into it, and that's what gets you over the finish line.
Love it. Last question. We've loved having you on the Marquis Masters podcast. How have you benefited from the products and services of Marquis Who's Who?
Well, I'll tell you what, when they first reached out, um, you know, when they broke down my history and all that, it gave us an opportunity to get us out there and tell a story. You know what I'm saying? And as far as the business goes, look, there's a lot of companies that are out there. What this has done is given me the opportunity for my information to get out there. So when people are looking at us as a potential customer and they go and they look at our background, especially now because with computers nowadays and the internet, you punch in somebody's name, you see their life story there. They punch in my information now, because I'm Marquis. You get to see that, hey, I'm an established individual. I'm recognized for what I've done. So that means I'm a quality individual, which means that, hey, if they deal with me, they know that they're getting somebody that stands by their word, and has a history of proving themselves and backing up what they say. I'm just not a flash in the pan salesman that's going to tell them what I need to tell them in order to get something done. They'll see that I'm a person of integrity.
Absolutely. And for folks that are listening, I encourage you to check out Bruce's website, superiorsecurityconsultants.com. And Bruce, what's the best place people can connect with you online?
Um, you can, like you say, on the website, you have the ability there to leave us messages. So if you want to reach out to us, there's an email that's there, and we'll respond to you.
Incredible. Bruce, thanks so much for the conversation today.
All right. Well, thank you.